The topic of my lecture today is issues of political obligation and civil disobedience. Now, ever since the inception of political science as an academic discipline, we find two questions in perennial opposition to each other. One is the is question and the other is the ought question. This brings us to the difference between the two terms obedience and obligation. Apparently, the two terms are synonymous, but they are not so in reality. There is a subtle difference, and what is that? When we say that men obey the state, it is a general, positive, affirmative statement. But when we say why men should obey the state, the question is transformed into a qualitatively new type of question which has a normative element and a value contained. So, in the earlier case, obedience is often elicited by threat or fear. But when it ripens into obligation, it is actuated not by fear, not by compulsion, but by a sense of duty. It is absolutely spontaneous. So, here we find the juxtaposition of factual explanation versus subjectively conscious explanation. So, the crux of the matter is that we obey the law, not because it is a law with a rod, a punishing rod, hanging over our head like the Damocles' sword, but because there is a higher law behind and above the law of the state, a value behind the law on the surface. That is what constitutes political obligation. So, obedience is superficial, but obligation is located at a much deeper level. So, let us now go into the thoughts of some of the proponents of these two concepts, or specifically speaking, the concept of political obligation. Here we find Lord James Bryce and his monumental work, Studies in History and Jurisprudence. The essential contention of Lord Bryce is that the main motives of obedience are indolence, deference, sympathy, fear, and reason. Now, indolence means complete inertia. That means when people do not even have that motivation to resist. Actually, it is a kind of fatalism where people are resigned to their fate. When the state becomes oppressive and tyrannical, it is then that the spirit of revolt is ignited. But when is that possible? If the people have the spirit, if the spirit itself is absent, then what is there to ignite? So people sometimes are so inert, so somnolent, that they lack the motive power to revolt against an oppressive state. That is what Bryce calls indolence. When it comes to deference, there is a feeling of emotion. There is a feeling of a kind of emotional identification, and it is here that the leadership question comes in. I think I will not be exaggerating if I cite the example of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who was the commander of the Azad Hind Force and the founder of the provisional Azad Hind government. As you all know, today he is being hailed and recognized as the first Prime Minister of independent India. I will not go into that. But if you go through the testimonies of those who worked under him, you will find that he had a certain charisma, and the support and the immense and massive mobilization which he was able to actualize as commander of the Azadin force was not something that was extracted or elicited by fear or threat or intimidation. People loved him, and that is what we call deference. Then there is another motivation to which Bryce refers, and that is sympathy. Here again, there is a kind of an emotional element, but sympathy also it emanates from the associative instincts of man. After all, man is a social animal. Man cannot live without society. Even Robinson Crusoe, that character in Daniel Defoe's novel, needed that newcomer Friday in that desolate island, because man just cannot live alone. But I may add one thing here, that something even greater than sympathy is there, and that is empathy. Sympathy is sometimes egoistic, just like altruism, just like philanthropy. It is sometimes egoistic. It has an element of ego. But empathy is totally bereft of the slightest trace of ego. Bryce did not mention empathy, he mentioned sympathy. I here would venture to add empathy also. And the other two motivations are fear and reason. Fear is relevant to a less civilized society, reminiscent of Hobbes' state of nature, which was nasty, which was brutish, and which was short. Reason, of course, is a higher virtue, and that is relevant where man realizes the value of order as civilization advances. Here we now pass over to the thoughts of Arthur Holcomb, and his work is The Foundations of the Modern Commonwealth. Now, he starts with a question which he places before us in a tone of surprise. He says the surprising feature of the age is the ease with which the many are governed by a few. How is it that the vast numbers of people place themselves under the governance, the command of a handful of people? How is it that the many have ruled over the few? Here he refers to the views of Hume and Disraeli and also Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hume finds the answer in opinion or consent. Disraeli rather locates it in the power of the sword of a standing army. Alexander Hamilton, however, refers to the authority of the rulers, which rests on the interest of the ruled in supporting the government. So after all, power becomes authority only when legitimacy is added to it. Then power is transformed into authority. And when does that happen? When the rulers rule in such a way that the ruled people realize that their own interests are being upheld. Now, the other factors are habit. Habit means what Holcomb implies here is that people are habituated to obedience. Then there is fear, there is force, and there is influence. And he also refers to inertia. Now, here, Holcomb is stepping into the shoes of Lord Bryce, isn't he? Just look at the factors listed by Lord Bryce and just compare them with the factors listed by Holcomb. All are the same. Only in place of the term indolence, he refers to the term inertia. And that is more or less comes to the same thing. One point which here requires explanation is that when we come to inertia, you see, there is always a difference between man and man. But that difference should not be measured in terms of the quantum of intelligence. Because all men have a certain intellectual level. It is the energy level, enterprise, incentive, stimulus, what Bergson would call elan vital. And this is manifested more than anything else in leadership. Leadership means not superior intelligence, but rather superior enterprise. That is the summation of the arguments of Arthur Holcomb. This is Harold Lasky. Just compare Harold Lasky's view with that of Holcomb. Like Holcomb, Lasky is also struck by this phenomena that in every epoch we find a multitude owing allegiance to a comparatively small number of men. Exactly the same fact, the same reality which fascinated Holcomb. Now, Lasky does not agree with Hobbes's view of fear as the basis of political obligation. Neither does he entirely agree with Sir Henry Maine's emphasis on habit, because there are various elements which create habit, and these elements are not so easy to identify and distinguish. He also does not agree with Bentham's utilitarian logic. He says that all theories are besides the mark, as no man can be treated as a purely rational animal. He says that human nature is very complex and very correct, because Alexander Pope said, "Virtuous and vicious every man must be, few in the extreme, but all in the degree." So human nature is a peculiar combination. And if we are to judge man as a total personality, then these complex impulses which guide him at every point must also be taken into consideration. Now, Bryce and Holcomb had emphasized on this psychological aspect. Lasky adds to that the sociological aspect. And his contention is that different epochs in history have different social and political environment and social situation. Now, we pass over to Ernest Barker. He rejected the divine right theory, saying that the idea of the king being a representative of God on earth is an anachronism. That is the product of a vanished age. And there is absolutely no justification of the right to resistance under this theory, where the omnicompetence of the king is vindicated. Barker also discards the theory of prescriptive possession, saying that it is applicable only to the monarchy, the monarchical form of government. Now, the logic is that whatever has been existing from time immemorial, and that is why it deserves to go on forever. Men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. But that is not scientific. And this does not lead us to a successful revolution, particularly when revolution is needed. Such reactionary conservatism takes us nowhere. It rather stifles our reason and it blocks change. And tyranny is the inevitable result. Now, the theory of contract is true, but within limits. Consent as the basis of political obligation is inadequate to the conscious and rational mind, because there are certain values and principles embodied in the state. And it is this value framework which constitutes the basis of obedience. And the consent theory does not highlight this. Now, Barker locates the roots of obligation in justice, which is the final principle. Justice is a synthesis of the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. After all, human nature, to reach its final fulfillment and to be fructified, demands this synthesis, this adjustment, this harmony, this equipoise. Justice is this synthesis. It is like an overflowing, ever-flowing, inexorable stream, not just a mechanical adjustment, not just an artificial balance, but it is related to an ultimate and final value. And the state is the organ and expression of justice. So here we find reflections of the Greek philosopher Plato. This is Thomas Hill Green. Green is primarily metaphysical and moral, and only secondarily a political philosopher. He refers to a kind of eternal consciousness. And this eternal consciousness is endowed with will, reason, and self-realization. And man, every man is a part of this eternal consciousness. And Green traces the roots of political obligation neither in fear nor in consent, but rather in the very nature of man. And he refers to the interdependence of man. Man is always dependent on one another, so the true good of one man is also the true good of another. So he here refers to the common good. And the state is an agency for man's ethical perfection. Here we find echoes of Aristotle. Green is more Aristotelian than Platonic. He is more Kantian than Hegelian. Now the point is that to realize the potentialities of harmony, adjustment, man requires society and institutions, without which he just cannot unfold his faculties, and he cannot elevate his imperfect self to the perfect self of God in man. But herein lies a contradiction in Green. While Green says will, not force, is the basis of the state, and the state is rather a product of man's moral necessity, and that it provides the external conditions for man's moral development and the guarantor of the rights of man, and that it applies coercion only to restrain the recalcitrant individuals from injuring the common good. All this is very good, but, and herein lies the biggest but, nowhere did he deny the state the right to determine this common good. So here, Green is either consciously or unconsciously vindicating the moral omnicompetence of the state and stepping into the shoes of totalitarianism, isn't he? Herein lies a contradiction. That is why we find a very eminent scholar, Amal Mukhopadhyay, characterizing the common good of Green as the uncommon common good. Now, Green's basic point is that a supreme coercive power is necessary for the formation of a state, but this power should be exercised in a certain way and for certain ends. Now, Green's theory is acceptable to the extent it goes. He says that simple fear of force does not constitute obedience, and that is right. To represent it as the basis of civil subjection is to confound the citizen with the slave. After all, it reminds me of a famous song by Qazi Nazrul Islam, তোমরা ভয় দেখিয়ে করছো শাসন জয় দেখিয়ে নয় সেই ভয়ের টুটি ধরবো টিপে করবো তারে লয়. That you are ruling us by intimidation and threat. You are trying to terrorize us, but you do not have any legitimacy. Here, joy means victory, but not in the literal sense. Here it means power without legitimacy. That means power without authority. So fear can never be the basis of the state. As I said earlier, when Subhash Chandra Bose was able to extract unstinted loyalty from the people, that was not obedience, that was obligation, because they felt that they were voluntarily surrendering themselves to a selfless leader. That is where obedience ripens into duty. So, subjection based upon fear cannot be the basis of political or free society. Now, a few words in the Indian perspective. If we look at the Mahabharata, in the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata, where Bhishma provides counsel to Yudhishthir, one of the counsels was that regarding Raja Dharma. What is the duty of the king? Here, dharma has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with the injunctions of kingship. And what is that? The point which Bhishma tries to convince Yudhishthir is that a king is like the father of his subjects. There's a kind of paternalism here. And it is the image which the king must construct for himself, which should not be the image of a tyrant or someone who is sort of oppressing his subjects through draconian measures. Let me give you one example. Bhishma says that during times of emergency, when there is a national calamity, taxation cannot be done away with, but taxation should not be exorbitant. That means the people should not be sort of burdened with such an enormous burden of taxation, load of taxation, that they lose their faith in the king and view him as a tyrant. The point is that taxation, it is even in times of emergency, taxation should be imposed in gradual doses, so that if initially the burden of taxation is less, even in times of emergency, then if in future the taxation rate is increased, people will not be disenchanted because they will not lose their faith in the king. So the king must be ensconced in their heart, and it is this which accounts for political obligation. And the Mahabharata continuously harps on this point, that under no circumstances should a king incur the wrath of the people by subjecting them to oppressive measures which exceeds their limits of toleration. Now, we come to the right to resistance here in the last part of my presentation today. Why do we resist the state? When do we resist the state? And what are the benefits or otherwise of resistance? Now, Green's attitude is somewhat cautious and ambivalent. He says that when we resist, we should do so in fear and trembling. Now, this is something which intrigues us. How can you resist in trembling? Now, don't take it literally. Go into the deeper significance. What Green is arguing is that so long as the state fulfills its obligation as the sustainer and reconciler of rights, obligation is absolute and unconditional. It is only for the defaulting state, the state which has abdicated its obligation, the state which has fallen from the esteem of the people, in order to restore that state to perfection, that resistance is needed. Now, the danger of resistance lies in the fact that it often breeds breach of law-abidingness. Mahatma Gandhi was one of the pioneers of the concept of resistance, though non-violent resistance. But what is noteworthy is that he broke the law, but never the spirit of law-abidingness. Here we find a kind of dichotomy, that law is being broken, but the spirit of law-abidingness is never broken. Now, Green's argument is that if resistance, even in the interest of the slave, results in a general anarchy and loss of freedom, it would outweigh the evil of obedience to bad laws when counterbalanced with it. Now, and Green had a lurking suspicion that if resistance became the order of the day, then anarchy would become very common and the results would be an unmitigated disaster. And so Green permits resistance only in the case of the worst governments where public spirit is conspicuous by its absence and where constitutional change is impossible. Now, Barker refers to the dilemma of the resistor. He refers to a political obligation and a super political obligation also. The first one is political and the second is obedience to the social thought about justice. So the resistor must also make a weighing and balancing between the mischiefs of obedience and the mischiefs of resistance. This weighing and balancing also finds its reverberation in the thoughts of Lasky. Lasky occupies a position somewhere in between Green and Barker. But he says that the gains of constitutionalism are more profound than revolution. And here he comes very close to Mahatma Gandhi. Constitutional methods should be exhausted first. And the right to disobedience must be exercised at the margins of political conduct. And here, before ending, I go over to the Indian perspective once again. Now, to conclude, we have already noted the views of Green, we have noted the views of Barker, we have noted the views of Lasky on resistance. Now, in Hindu political theory, we find a categorical assertion that a tyrannical king must be resisted. There are instances cited in Mahabharata where exemplary punishment was treated out to tyrannical kings. Bhishma talks about King Shagor, who expelled his son from his kingdom because he was oppressing the subjects. There are also instances of a king being cursed by God because of being oppressive. And there are also references to dicta like an oppressive king being kicked out of the kingdom just as one kicks out a mad dog from the precincts of a village. So in the Mahabharata, it is unequivocally clear, it is made unequivocally clear that if the king does not rule in the interests of the people, then the people have every right to resist him and also dethrone him from his pedestal. So here we find reflections of Locke. Locke allowed this right to resistance, and unlike Green, unlike Barker, unlike Lasky, who were very cautious in their advocacy of this right to resistance, but in the Mahabharata we find a more positive and categorical assertion and affirmation of the right to resistance. So, I conclude saying that in ancient Indian political thought, right to resistance is considered justified without qualifications as Green, Barker and Lasky attached to it. Thank you.